Hi everyone, welcome to the Tulip Group. We have worked long and hard to come up with a comprehensive lesson to teach you everything that we have learned thus far. We have split our lesson into two parts, and this hopefully makes the information a bit easier to absorb. We start with part one, and this goes over the basic biology of the plant. This explains the anatomy, the tulip's domestication, how it's gone from its wild ancestor to its current one, and we even go over the modern breeding of the plant. This then takes us into part two, which discusses the historical component of tulips. We talk about how tulips entered Europe and how their rise in popularity quickly spread throughout the continent. This leads into the main topic of the tulip mania, and we will see how the tulips caused an overall economic collapse in the Dutch economy. There's a lot to unpack here regarding tulips and how they really affected not only the Netherlands, but Europe as a whole. So let's start with the biology of the tulip in the beginning. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Amira White. Welcome to part one of the Tulip Group presentation, where I will discuss the biology of the tulip. The first topic that I will be discussing is where exactly was the tulip domesticated? The domestication of the tulip first took place in Turkey during the 16th century by the Ottoman Empire. During that time, the tulip was domesticated strictly for religious and art purposes. The Ottomans were known to use tulips and have them engraved in structures such as mosques, water fountains, and graves. They viewed the tulip as a religious flower since the words to make tulip were the same as to make the word Allah. So many of them viewed the flower as a way of securing their way into heaven and being closer to God. The two pictures that I presented are a garden in Isfahan where the Ottomans were known to plant various flowers. One of the flowers they planted were, of course, tulips. If you look at the pictures and to where the arrows are pointing, you can see a little bit of the tulips that were planted in the gardens. The next thing that I'm going to discuss is the modern breeding of the tulip. Now, today, the main purpose of modern breeding of the tulip is to make sure that the plant is going to be resistant to the various diseases that have been known to cause harm to the tulip. Now, one disease that has been known to attack the tulip, it's called Fusarium oxysporum, which causes the bulb of the tulip to rot during storage, which basically kills the tulip and the plant is no longer no good, so you would have to discard of it and pretty much, plant again and start over and hope that it wouldn't happen again. The next disease is called Botrytis tulipae, which is known as tulip fire, which causes the leaves to twist and to turn like a reddish color and become a little blighted. You can see it in the third image that I have. It better shows exactly what Botrytis tulipae looks like. Um, the last one is known as the tulip breaking virus, which is known to infect the bulb of the tulip and cause the single color to break, leading to like stripes and streaks within the plant. It gives off like a flame-like effect of different colors on the petal. Now, back then during the tulip craze, the plants that were breaking were the ones that people were like fighting for. So it's kind of ironic that today they're not, I don't want to say of much value, but the scientists and like florists are working like really hard to make sure that, the bulbs or the plants are not experiencing the tulip breaking virus because it's actually not good. Although the plant does appear to look beautiful, it's actually not really in the best of shape. The last thing that I'm going to be discussing is whether or not the tulip has been known to be used as some kind of medicine, drug, poison, or any other health purposes. So in the Middle East, there is a tulip known as the desert tulip or Tulip acistola that you can see in the picture right here. It is commonly found under and between rocks in the desert, and the people of Iraq have been known to widely use it as a herb in the form of traditional medicine. The chemical compounds, which you can see in the second picture, have been known to be used as a anti-inflammatory remedy and a pain relief remedy, which has been proven to be very effective and useful for the people of Iraq, especially those who have a hard time just being able to get to some kind of medicine. So it's nice to know that the desert tulip is an effective use of a pain relief medicine. Tulip bulbs have also been known to be used as a source of food and a way for people to gain nutrients. During the Hunger Winter, which was also known as the Dutch famine, many people mistook tulip bulbs as some kind of food since it bears such a close resemblance to onion bulbs. So many assumed that it could be consumed and there really wouldn't be an issue. During 1945, tulip bulbs, along with sugar beets and potato peels, they were all processed together and distributed throughout many soup kitchens in Rotterdam to feed those who had become severely exhausted and ill due to the famine. In the top photo, you can see a group of women in Rotterdam in the year of 1945. They are sitting around preparing tulip bulbs to be consumed by everyone because that was their only source of food that they could get their hands on during that time period. Tulip bulbs have also been known to be very, very toxic to those who handle them without some kind of protection over their hands. In the first image, this person is being very careful and cautious and they are handling the tulip bulbs with some gloves on their hands. Those who choose to not have any type of glove or protection over their hands, they have been known to experience something called tulip fingers, which you can see in the second image. Tulip fingers is basically contact dermatitis on the skin and fingers. The tulip bulbs contain an allergen known as tulipalin A, which is known to be very, very, very toxic to people who come into contact with it by not wearing any gloves on their hands when touching the bulbs. Those who usually experience tulip fingers, they have hyperpigmentation on their skin. Their nails will start to ridge a little bit. They experience either some type of bacterial or fungal infection where the nail and skin meets, which causes some bit of, discoloration. So it's, advised to wear some type of protection over your hands so that you don't have to experience tulip fingers because it looks a little painful.
In this slide, we will be covering the anatomy of the tulip in two parts, the flowering structure and the reproductive parts. A tulip is an angiosperm, like other flowering plants. As we learned in this semester, angiosperms usually fall under two categories, which are the monocots and the dicots. They have distinct differences between the two. Tulips are considered a monocot due to their flowering structure that comes in multiples of threes. Let's look at the image on the slide. As you can see, the green stem, this helps to transport nutrients from the roots up to the plant and helps to stabilize the tulip. You can also see that 2 to 3 leaves located at the base of the tulip. Moving up the stem, there are 3 sepals and 3 petals. So you can see the multiples of 3s. So after going over the flowering structure, this helps define the tulip as a monocoque. Moving on to reproductive parts, the stamen serves as the male productive organs that are made up of the anther and the filament. The filament holds up the anther, which serves a purpose of producing pollen. The pistil is the female reproductive organ that includes the stigma, style, and ovary. The stigma is 3-lobed and located at the top of the pistil, as shown in the image. It is a sticky structure that helps to capture pollen. Beneath the stigma is the style that connects the stigma to the ovary. The ovary is also 3 lobes and is used to produce and house unfertilized eggs. This concludes the anatomy of the tulip.
Part 2. The historical impact of tulips. Tulips arrived in Belgium around 1562. They were tucked away within the contents of a cargo ship. The merchant who received the shipment found the bulbs, and he assumed they were some unusual, odd sort of onion. So he ate some, and he planted the rest in his garden, and they bloomed around 1563. From here, he showed his friend Georges Rye the tulips, and he was fascinated with them. So he transplanted some for himself, and he grew them. From here, the tulips traded hands from Georges Rye to Carolus Clusius, the father of tulips. Carolus Clusius was a botanist, and at the time, botany wasn't a separate field of study. It fell under a branch of medicine that tried to identify medicinal plants. He spent his entire life traveling around Europe looking for rare plants. When he would find them, he would mail seeds of these plants to his friends. He never really had a stable living situation due to his constant traveling, so he treated his friends' gardens as if they were his own. They would plant things he would send, and he would see how they turned out. It wasn't until the year 1565 that it is believed Clusius first saw the tulip flower himself. He had come back from Spain and traveled to Georges Rye's garden, where he was able to lay his own eyes on the unusual plant. Clusius is known to be the father of tulips. He is accredited to be the one that truly helped spread tulips across Europe. I stated before that Clusius would often send seeds of rare plants to his friends, and he did this exact same thing with tulips. He sent them north, south, east, west, quite literally all over Europe. Because of Clusius, tulips were able to spread far more rapidly than they would have otherwise. However, Clusius not only distributed tulips, but for a man of his time, he had an incredible understanding of tulips. He was able to catalog 34 different groups of tulips, and was the first person to be able to distinguish the difference between early, mid, and late flowering tulips. He even made observations in his journals noting the tulip-breaking virus. From tulip cultivation, observations, and cataloging, it's clear that future botanists had much to learn from Carolus Clusius. So let's go back now and consider how tulip bulbs have been distributed throughout Europe. The year is 1600, and there is this idea that has spread that the tulip is considered the supreme flower. We can tell that popularity is slowly but surely rising. However, the availability for them has not increased in the slightest. Small groups of rich connoisseurs begin popping up that start to trade tulips in places like Italy, England, and the Netherlands has the largest group out of all. These connoisseurs were less fascinated with the tulip itself and more interested in how much a profit these flowers would end up bringing in. Now we can fast forward, and the year is 1620. The Dutch revolt is occurring, and some may know this as the 80 Years' War. The Netherlands is trying to gain their independence from Spain, so this is not a pretty time in history. There were thousands fleeing from religious persecution, trying to seek asylum. The size of Dutch towns were doubling, and the Netherlands began growing at an alarming rate. The popularity of tulips continued to rise at the time as well. The class of individuals that really became active in trading tulips were members of the ruling class. The Dutch referred to these individuals as regents, and this would include people like physicians, businessmen, and lawyers. If you weren't considered a regent to the Dutch, then you were somewhat along the lines of a rich merchant. Another thing to note is that the immigrants coming from Spain were not all lower class. Some of them were extremely wealthy and would later find themselves taking part in the tulip trade like many others. The key takeaway here is that all of the people that were participating in the tulip trade during this period were still wealthy and had much more money compared to the rest. Since members of the upper class were the main stakeholders in the beginning of the tulip trade, it gave the flower a whole new status and meaning. I previously mentioned it was the supreme flower, but now the tulip symbolizes wealth, nobility, and lavish beauty. It became a status symbol to have them or even decorate yourself with them. However, as popular as they were still incredibly hard to come across. You could be the richest of the rich and still not be able to afford one single rare tulip bulb. And this is how we come to understand the mindset of a tulip trader in the 1600s. It's important to understand this mindset moving forward to see how the tulip trade made it to the extreme that it did. The finest tulip varieties were the most difficult to find, so they were the ones people wanted the most. Because they were the ones most sought after, they were the most expensive tulips. Because they were most expensive to buy, that meant they were also the most profitable to grow. This kind of mindset explains the long and expensive and outrageous years that follow. This was only the beginning of the tulip mania.
During the early days of tulip mania, most of the trading was done between gardeners and connoisseurs who appreciated the mystery and beauty of this new flower, and also botanists who wanted to study the anatomy of the tulip. These trades took place primarily between friends or fellow colleagues and were limited to the relatively small amount of tulip varieties that had been discovered or bred by that point. Tulip mania was reaching its peak towards the end of 1636. By this point, the way bulbs were traded had drastically changed. What was once done by close friends and colleagues in small numbers was now done in huge quantities by anyone and everyone that wanted to get rich by selling tulip bulbs. These transactions were typically done by auction in the back rooms of taverns like the Golden Grape, located in the city of Haarlem. These auctions were done mostly in two different ways. If a buyer wanted to purchase the bulbs, the auction was done with the boards. A slate was given to the buyer and seller, and each party would write the amount they thought the bulbs were worth. Naturally, the buyer would choose a very low price, and the seller a very high price. These slates were then passed to intermediaries who would then decide on a price that was considered fair for both parties between the two original prices. The buyer and seller would then decide if they wanted to finalize the transaction. The second type of auction was called "in the little O", and it was initiated by someone wishing to sell their bulbs. A symbol like this was written on a board, with a bounty price written in the little o on the bottom. This amount was what the seller thought their bulbs were worth. A secretary would then take the bids of potential buyers writing the highest bid in thousands in the top half circle, hundreds in the bottom half circle, and how many bulbs the buyer wished to buy below the line. When the bidding was done, the secretary would mark 3 lines and then circle the entire symbol. The seller would then decide if the highest bid was acceptable and either accept or reject the auction. If the seller rejected the highest bid, they would have to give the stymied buyer the bounty. Because of this, the seller was more inclined to accept the bids rather than reject them. Wouter Winkle was a tavern keeper in the town of Alkmaar and had 7 children with his wife, Elizabeth. Sadly, both Wouter and Elizabeth died at an early age, leaving their children to the care of the local orphanage. However, the Winkle children had something the other children living at the orphanage did not. They had their father's tulip bulb collection. The Winkle bulbs were put up for auction on February 5th, 1637. Because Winkle's collection included some of the most rare and sought-after bulbs, including Viceroys and Admiral Leifkins, the auction drew the attention of upscale connoisseurs and prosperous dealers of the time. The results of the auction did not disappoint for the Winkle children and for the health of the tulip trade. Bringing in 90,000 guilders, the Winkle children were all set for life financially, and with most of the bulbs selling for enormous prices, the tulip trade was kept alive longer than it otherwise would have. Many of the buyers and sellers of tulip bulbs were starting to question the validity of the trade. With prices constantly inflating at an extremely high rate, and with no real rules or regulations to the tulip trade, the instability and unpredictability was starting to take over. The Winkle auction delayed the downfall of the tulip trade, if only for a short time. Tulip mania was coming to an end.
The end of tulip mania. The downfall of tulip mania in the New Providence affected everyone. However, it affected some people more so than others. The Assembly of Growers. When the market finally collapsed, the Great Assembly of Growers gathered on February 23, 1637, to determine the future of the trade. They determined that it was in the best interest of the growers to try to mitigate as much financial loss as possible. This was fine for them, but it didn't help the rest of the people in the industry. The court system. Because the tulip mania created and lost such large amounts of money, it was inevitable that the judicial system would come into play. Due to the lawsuits over the sale, purchases, and the ownership of the bulbs, it was thus evident that the tulip trade's troubles could not be resolved by the individuals within the tulip bulb trade alone. Some of the higher authority would have to rule on who owned the thousands of tulips bought and sold before February 1637, and more importantly, who should pay for them. After the fallout, it was obvious that the economy of the tulip trade could not keep on its current trajectory. This was due to the instability and unpredictability of growing tulips and waiting 6 to 8 months to see the results. Tulip bulbs were often mistaken for different varieties and sold for a different price. It didn't take long for the New Providence's economy to bounce back. People either went back to their old professions or started new careers. Interventions were made in order to stabilize the markets, and the tulip growers and traders started exporting the flowers to the rest of Europe. It was evident that society of the New Providence essentially realized the consequences of the tulip mania. Paintings were depicted to show the silliness and severity of following such a trend like tulip mania. Allegory of Tulip Mania by Jan Bruegel the Younger. This painting depicts people as monkeys, going about their normal lives in the tulip trade business during the tulip mania. This painting is to show the silliness of the tulip infatuation. You can see them inspecting and trading tulips, fighting and stealing tulips, and enjoying group activities. You can tell by their accessories and clothes that the artist is trying to show their individual status within society. The Tulip Folly by Jean-Léon Jerome. In this scene, you can see a noble guardsman protecting an exceptionally bloomed tulip, while the other soldiers trample flower beds in a vain attempt to stabilize the tulip market by limiting the supply. The Bubonic Plague. To give some insight into the life of someone living in the New Providence during the 1630s, more than 5,700 people died of the bubonic plague while the tulip trade was close to its height between August and November of 1636. This was one out of 8 people who made up the total population of the city of Haarlem, so many that there were not enough graves to hold the dead. I think it's interesting to think about how during a time when there is a global pandemic going on, that people would be willing to pay a ridiculously crazy amount of money for a flower. Maybe people were so caught up in the moment, realizing that death could be around the corner, that they desired to get lost in something so beautiful. Other tulip manias. It's also important to note that although tulip mania in the New Providences was significantly impactful to that region, it was also not the only place to have tulip mania. Europe, and specifically Istanbul and modern-day Turkey, placed a great cultural value and importance on the tulip. This was in part due to Sultan Ahmed III's love and passion for the flower and his influence over the people that he controlled. Coming to America. The tulip first came to the shores of America during the 1850s. They were purchased by Richard Sullivan Fay, Esquire. He was a hobbyist horticulturist who owned a large swath of land near Lynn and Salem, Massachusetts. There he planted the first garden on his estate. The epicenter of New Providence's mania was Haarlem. It continues to be the location for trading the finest tulips. Tulips still hold a strong cultural significance to many different countries and locations. However, today tulips are synonymous with the country of Holland and Dutch culture. Holland continues to be the largest exporter of the flower, and it is evident that their love for the flower still exists. Here's a clip from a previous video we watched in class.
This tulip, that is my favorite. I give it a big future. Just the right color, pure pink. This one I started 9 years ago with seed. When I saw this tulip blooming for the first time in my seedlings, I was just amazed. I sat there on my knees and looked at him for a long time. Other tulips, you walk by and it doesn't mention anything to you. And when you see this one, your heart gets... That makes a difference. Each time I look at it, I fell in love on that tulip.